The night shift at Helix 9 always began in silence. Deep under the crust, wrapped in concrete, alloy, and kilometers of rock, the research complex hummed at a frequency that felt more like pressure than sound. The air was cold and dry inside the primary control room. Rows of consoles glowed in steady bands, pushing pale light across the floor and up the glass of the observation wall. Dr. Aaron Rhee sat alone at his station, hands resting on the edge of the console rather than on the keys. The monitors around him streamed a constant fall of numbers, background radiation, cosmic microwave fluctuations, noise profiles from the outer sensor arrays. None of it, on most nights, meant anything more than the sky breathing. It was almost 2 in the morning. Complex time. He reached for his mug, found it empty, and set it back down without looking. Coffee was habit. The numbers were habit. The quiet was habit. The thing that was not habit sat in the center of his chest. A tightness that had never fully left since the day Helix 9 lost more than its first test article. An alert popped onto the upper right display. Rift monitor channel 04B. Anomalous signature detected. Source: external sensor plane gamma. Aaron straightened. The channel tag alone was enough. Channel 04B watched the same patch of sky that had once fed data to temporal burst incident TBI-01. The test that had killed his son. He did not let that thought surface fully. He focused on the pattern instead. A dense spike of compressed data sat like a stone in the noiseband. No gradual ramp, no natural curve, no familiar signature from satellites, relays, or the debris that circled the planet. "Root it," he said. The room did not need a second person to obey. The control software listened to his ID and began unpacking the packet. Spectral graphs rose and settled. Red markers flagged non-random structure. The decoding pipeline shifted from raw energy analysis to pattern recognition. The header metadata rolled past on another screen. No match. Known transmitters. No match. Known modulation schemes. Duration estimate: 20.3 seconds. A 20-second stone dropped into the fabric of their measurements. Aaron keyed in a command. Voice low. HELIX9 core. Prioritize audio reconstruction. Full noise profile. Cross-reference with archive filters. The system acknowledged. Lines of code pushed into motion. It took less than a minute. The packet had been small and viciously efficient. As if whoever sent it had known exactly how much the gate of reality would allow. The speaker array above his station clicked. At first it was only static, like sand washing across glass. Then the filter corrected, and static became air, someone's air. Not the dry conditioned flow of the complex. There was the faint rise and fall of breathing. A voice spoke into that air. "Dad." The word cut through every layer of training he had. Aaron did not move. The pressure in his chest turned to something sharp. The monitors stayed with him. Numbers flowing, graphs tracing, as if nothing had changed. The voice continued, a little faster, as if the speaker had not been given much time to talk. "If this reaches you, you can't let them open it again. Not all the way. Whatever they promised you, whatever they say it fixes, it doesn't. It tears everything apart." Aaron reached for the console with fingers that refused to steady. "Identify voice," he said. The system obeyed, overlaying waveforms, comparing shapes of sound to the deep recordings stored in archive red sigma. The voice went on over his head, words coming in short pushes. "I'm not supposed to be in your world anymore. I shouldn't be able to talk to you at all. That's the point. If you open the gate, you don't just pull power. You pull pieces of places that were never meant to touch." Static rose again as the signal strained at its limit. "Dad, please, do not let them open it." The last word fractured against a whine of interference. Then everything cut to silence. The monitors dropped back to their usual streams. The speakers hummed once and went dead. The analysis pane in front of him populated with a preliminary result. Echo 20 packet. Duration: 20.3 seconds. Content type: audio, human voice. Confidence: speaker match, 99.997%. Archive reference: Daniel Rhee. Age 12. Daniel. Aaron stared at the screen until the symbols blurred. It felt as if someone had taken the moment of his son's death, fixed it in crystal, and then turned it until new facets he had never seen caught the light. A 20-second message from a boy who had been dead for years. He forced himself to move. Fingers settled on the controls and began isolating the packet, copying it into a secure buffer, locking it behind his personal key. The more automatic his motions, the less room his mind had to fall into the impossible. Whatever the voice was, echo, artifact, or something else, it had found its way onto a channel no one used for anything but the background breathing of the universe. And it had known his name. The lab smelled of burnt dust and cold metal, even when nothing was on fire. By the time the echo of his son's voice finished circling in his head for the 20th time, Aaron had dragged 2 senior analysts from their stations and locked them in the secondary analysis suite. The door behind them sealed with a quiet hydraulic thump. Dr. Mara Ellen stood at one side of the central table, arms folded, eyes narrowed at the projection in front of her. On the other side, a younger specialist from Temporal Systems Division leaned closer to the display, hands hovering over virtual controls, careful not to touch anything without being asked. "Run it again," Aaron said. The audio waveform of Echo 20 unfolded in 3 dimensions. Every peak and valley, every microsecond of sound, sat suspended in light above the table. Vertical bands of color marked frequency clusters. Mara adjusted one of the filters, then triggered the playback. "Dad, if this reaches you." The voice filled the room. Aaron watched the analysts instead of the projection. The younger specialist swallowed, then tried to hide it. Mara kept her eyes on the wavefronts, jaw tight. When the message ended, the room fell back into the soft noise of ventilation and distant machinery. "Start with the match," Aaron said. The younger analyst pulled up a comparison set. "We ran it against every reference clip in Archive Red Sigma. Age 12 through 13. School recordings, medical scans, home audio, the ones you authorized to share. Spectrogram alignment comes back at 99.997. The residual gap is within our calibration error." "So?" Mara asked. Her voice was dry, not unkind. "So the system says it is him," the analyst said, with higher confidence than most courtroom identifications. Aaron let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "Could it be synthetic?" Mara asked. "Constructed from those same archives?" "We looked for that," the analyst said quickly. "We checked for stitching artifacts, discontinuities in the high band, anything that would suggest compositing. The temporal micro-jitter in the consonants, the way the noise floor rides his breath, it all tracks as a single, continuous recording. If it is fake, it is better than anything on record, including our own generative models." Mara flicked to another view. A fresh array of data bloomed: timestamps, energy levels, channel histories. "What about the path?" she asked. "Where did this thing come from?" "That is the part we can't file under known categories," the analyst said. "The outer sensor logs show a spike in the gamma plane, but the phase reading is wrong." Aaron stepped closer. "Show me." A new graph appeared, a narrow spike on a line that represented coherence in time. For most of Helix 9's instruments, that line sat flat. The universe, to a first approximation, flowed in one direction. Here, at the moment the packet arrived, the line dipped. "It is off by how much?" Aaron asked. "Microseconds," the analyst replied, "but not in the usual way. It's not instrument lag. It looks like the source of the packet was sitting in a frame where the clock was slightly misaligned with ours. The easiest way to say it is that the signal came from a layer that is almost our now. But not quite. A temporal decoherence layer," Mara said quietly. The term hung there, clinical and cold. Aaron remembered another graph, years earlier, drawn by a younger version of himself who thought he was only mapping an interesting corner of the math. He had sketched out the possibility of narrow bands of time where events could diverge briefly before snapping back. A gentle wobble in causality. A curiosity. Then Helix 9 had built the first prototype of the temporal gate array. And an experiment tagged TBI-01 had ripped a hole big enough for a 12-year-old boy to fall through. He saw the corridor again. The emergency lights flashing in a rhythm designed to calm no one. The thin line of scorched paint running down the wall at ankle height where the burst had glanced off matter. The med team pushing a gurney past him. The sheet already pulled too far up a small, still face. The memory arrived fully formed, as if triggered by the numbers. He gripped the edge of the table. The official report said no foreign signals were detected during TBI-01. Mara said, just a self-induced surge. The official report said a lot of things. Aaron replied. The younger analyst shifted his weight, uncomfortable in the gravitational field of something he did not understand. What are you thinking? Mara asked. Aaron studied the floating waveform of his son's voice. 20 seconds of sound from a place that should not be able to speak to them. I am thinking, he said slowly, that we might not be the only version of that day. Or of any day. And that in at least one of them. My son lived long enough to watch what happens when they open the gate again. No one answered. There were no protocols for this. No forms to fill. No standard operating procedure that began with receiving a message from the alternate survival of someone you had buried. Mara broke the silence first. We should flag this to Director Holt and the council. She said, it will surface sooner or later. Better that it come from us. Aaron nodded, though every part of him wanted to lock the data away and never let it see light. Hiding it would not make it less real. We will send them the clean analysis. He said, not our guesses. The guesses stay here until we have something more than a word for what we are looking at. He saved the current state of the project, encrypted Echo 20 behind another layer of his credentials, and watched as the system sealed the record with a quiet confirmation chime. Somewhere above them, beyond the rock and frozen soil, the world continued burning fuel it did not have, drawing power from grids that coughed and staggered. Down here, 20 seconds of impossible sound waited to be misunderstood. The council chamber was never in darkness. Even in what passed for night in the capital, the circular room remained lit by a band of soft light that ran just below the ceiling, giving every face the same pale clarity. It was good for recordings, for history, and for cutting away the excuse of shadows. Aaron stood at the edge of the central floor, Helix 9's crest glowing discreetly on the sleeve of his jacket. Around him, the representatives of the Global Energy Council sat in their tiers, their interfaces casting faint reflections in their eyes. A holographic map hung over the floor. It was not of borders or trade routes, but of power. Whole regions glowed in sickly gradients, blackouts in one hemisphere, brownouts in another, thin bands of fragile stability flickering along the coastlines. HELIX-9 remains our most promising option, said Senator Ryland Greaves, his voice measured. Conservation measures have bought us time, but not enough. New solar arrays will not save Sirian Plateau. Tidal harnesses will not keep North Meridian lit through the next 2 winters. We need a source that does not care about weather or hours. Director Karen Holt sat not far from Aaron. Back straight, hands folded, her hair was pulled tight, the same way it always had been when she briefed them on test results years ago. Before TBI-01, the look on her face now was the same, too. Composed, intent, unwilling to yield any part of the narrative to doubt. The Helix initiative was suspended after the first incident, she said, not because the physics failed, but because we underestimated the instability of our initial design. We have learned from that. Our models are cleaner. Our control systems are several generations beyond what we had then. Greaves gestured, and a new projection came to life. Energy curves rising like tides. Colored arcs that represented potential yield from even a conservative opening of the temporal gate array. In light of the data provided by Dr. Rhee and his team, Greaves said, we now know the array can couple to something real. The Echo 20 packet may be unexpected, but it is proof of function. We are not pushing into the dark. We are fine-tuning a connection that already exists. The clipped phrase made Aaron's skin tighten. He forced his voice out, aware of how small it sounded in the room. The packet is not proof of safe coupling, he said. It is proof that interaction can happen in directions we do not control. The content of the message. Holt cut in smoothly. The content of the message has been entered into the record, she said. We all heard it. We have all seen the analysis. There is no conclusive evidence that the speaker understood the full nature of the phenomenon he was inside. He described what he saw in terms he had Not in terms of the underlying physics. He was my son, Aaron said. Holt met his gaze without flinching. And that is exactly why we must be careful not to let personal tragedy skew global decision-making. The words landed with the precision of a scalpel. Several council members shifted in their seats. But none interrupted. Greaves folded his hands. Dr. Rhee, he said, no one in this room doubts your pain. Many of us have buried people because of this crisis. But we cannot let a single anomalous message, no matter how compelling its emotional content, hold hostage the future of every grid on this map. He pointed at the projections. At the dark patches blooming wider each month. If we do nothing, he continued, hospitals will lose power, water systems will fail, entire cities will die not in fire, but in slow, preventable cold. Against that, one anomaly does not weigh much. Holt's voice came in after his, steady as stone. One anomaly, she said, cannot outweigh the fate of billions. The sentence moved through the chamber like a line drawn in ink. Greaves nodded once. The motion before us is to authorize the full reactivation of the Helix Initiative and the Temporal Gate Array Program. With revised safeguards and oversight from Strategic Oversight Command. All in favor? Hands lifted. Light from the voting system marked them in soft green. When the count appeared along the ring, the margin was not even close. Aaron listened to the numbers. Then to the quiet at the end of them. The chair's voice confirmed the decision. Motion carried. Helix 9 is hereby instructed to prepare for phased reactivation. Director Holt, you will coordinate with the council liaison to establish timelines. Holt inclined her head. Understood. A chime signaled the formal close of the session. Conversations broke out in low, relieved murmurs as representatives began to stand, already speaking into their private lines, already turning this decision into policy and speech. On the central floor, the room emptying around him, Aaron remained still. Someone had cued Echo 20 in the chamber's audio log, set to play as a reference for those who had not been in the preliminary briefing. As technicians cycled the system down, the first seconds of the message bled into the room again. Dad, if this reaches you. It sounded thinner here, filtered through processors designed for legal clarity, stripped of the small intakes of breath that had made it hurt so much the first time. It had been turned from a plea into evidence. Aaron closed his eyes. They had taken a warning from another slice of reality and turned it into a green light. If he did nothing now, he would not just be the man who had signed off on the experiment that killed his son. He would be the man who watched a second time as the same door opened. Knowing that on the other side of that threshold existed at least one version of his child who had already seen what waited there. He opened his eyes again. This is not going to stop on its own, he said under his breath. No one answered. The council chamber did not argue. It had already given him its verdict. The second time Aaron dissected the message, he refused to listen to the words. He and Mara Ellen stood in the spectral lab, a smaller, windowless room nested inside Helix 9's core. The walls were lined with sensor racks and redundant processors. In the center, a domed projector threw layers of data into the air, fields of color, grids, and contour lines floating in a slow rotation. Echo 20 sat there as a compact knot of information, held in the middle like a foreign body waiting for surgery. Strip it down, Aaron said. Mara's fingers moved through the control field with practiced precision. She had pulled more secrets out of bad data than anyone in Temporal Systems Division. Her dark hair was tied back, her expression all focus. Whatever she thought about the voice in the recording, she kept it out of the room. The primary waveform vanished, leaving behind a ghostly haze of noise. We've already seen the audio, she said. Now we look at what rides with it. She brought up the low-level channels, phase drift, ambient field readings, sideband artifacts. The haze sharpened into threads. Values scrolled along the side of the display. Pressure, temperature, magnetic flux, baseline radiation. These should all match our environment within tolerance, Mara said. Nothing leaves the sensor plane without carrying some imprint of its origin. Aaron watched the numbers settle. They did not land where they should have. Atmospheric pressure is off, he said, higher than HELIX 9. By a lot. 0.9 bars above us. Mara confirmed. Temperature is different too. 4 degrees higher than the complex. And the magnetic field, that's the strange part. She expanded the magnetic profile. The smooth line he was used to seeing from Helix 9's stable field was gone. In its place was a jagged trace with rhythmic spikes, as if some external engine kept kicking space with an invisible foot. "That isn't local," Aaron said. "We don't have any generators that throw a pattern like that." "Not anymore," Mara said quietly. They both thought of the prototypes that had died after TBI-01. The early versions of the temporal gate array had produced field profiles that safety reviews had labeled non-repeatable anomalies before the program was shut down. Mara overlaid one of those old profiles on the new trace. The colors did not match perfectly, but the rhythm did. Peaks and troughs lined up well enough to make the hair rise on Aaron's arms. "Whoever sent this," she said, "was near an active gate. Not ours, not now, but some gate. Look at the radiation bands," Aaron said. She toggled another filter. The background noise shifted into a spectrum. There, woven into the edges, were thin bright lines, markers of high-energy activity that did not exist in Helix 9's well-shielded environment. "This is a snapshot," Aaron said. "A tiny one, but enough. Pressure, temperature, field profile, radiation. It's not our world." Mara nodded. "Not exactly," she said, "but close enough that the instruments didn't reject it as nonsense. That's why it slid through." He stepped closer to the projection. Echo 20's core pulsed in the middle of the data. A compressed capsule of sound. "A layer," he said slowly. "A layer sitting right next to us in time. Same general conditions, same kind of facility, but someone there pushed the gate further than we have. And they didn't like what they saw." "That's your reading," Mara said. "As a physicist." "As a physicist," he said, "and as someone who watched this place tear itself open once." She did not argue. He swept one hand through the control field. The data reorganized. A simplified model of spacetime appeared, a flat sheet for their present. And another, close enough to brush, offset at a shallow angle. "This is what I was playing with years ago," he said, "when HELIX 9 was still just equations and budget fights. The idea that there could be nearby configurations of events. Not separate universes, not magic, just alternative arrangements of cause and effect, separated by small phase differences." Mara watched as he drew a narrow gap between the sheets. "A temporal decoherence layer," she said, "the place where neither timeline fully dominates." He nodded. "If you drive a gate in one timeline hard enough, and a similar gate in a neighboring timeline reaches a compatible state at almost the same instant, you carve a tiny channel through that layer. And information spills," Mara said. "Not matter," Aaron said. "Not people. They're too heavy. In a way that has nothing to do with kilograms. But a 20-second burst of compressed audio? That can slip along the fracture." Mara looked back up at the model. 2 planes, 1 corridor between them, thin as a blade. "So in that other layer," she said, "they opened their gate. They kept using it, long enough to ruin their sky. Long enough to make your son understand that something had gone very wrong." Aaron did not answer right away. He watched the little channel he had drawn. In his head, it was no longer just a line between abstractions. It was something a boy might have stared into, knowing he should not exist on the side he could see. "We don't know how he found the corridor," Aaron said at last, "or who helped him. Echo 20 doesn't tell us that." "No," Mara said, "but we know enough to say this. He wasn't talking about theory. He was reporting from inside the consequences." The dome dimmed as the projection paused, leaving them in the soft, even light of the lab. For a few heartbeats, the only sound was the faint hum of processors working somewhere behind the walls. Aaron took the recording home that night, even though he knew he should not. Home was a narrow apartment 2 floors above one of Helix 9's maintenance rings. The complex had never been meant for families. Half the units were storage conversions. The other half were occupied by people who had traded surface life for proximity to the most dangerous machine ever built. He sat at the small table by the window, the glass showing only black rock and the ghost of his own reflection. The speakers of his terminal were set low enough that no sound would escape the room. He tapped play. "Dad, if this reaches you." The words came again, but he pushed them to the edge of his attention. He focused on the spaces between them. The hitch of Daniel's inhalation at the start. The tiny scrape of fabric somewhere near the microphone. The faint hiss that underlay every syllable. He filtered the signal in his head, the way he had watched the software do in the lab. There, beneath the voice, was a tone. A long, unbroken note at the edge of hearing. Not mechanical. Not exactly. It reminded him of high-tension lines in winter, when moisture and voltage conspired to make steel sane. Behind that tone, distorted by the compression, came brighter spikes, sharp, periodic alarms. They were not Helix 9's patterns. The timing was wrong. They rose too fast, fell too slow, as if the entire building on the other side of the fracture were breathing through damaged lungs. Something crackled, faint but insistent. Electric discharge, hunting for a path to ground. The environment in that 20-second window was not quiet. It was a space under siege by its own systems. He replayed the last third of the message. Daniel's voice climbed slightly, not quite to panic, but to an urgency that made Aaron's chest feel hollow. I shouldn't be able to talk to you at all. That's the point. Static ate the end of the sentence. Underneath the noise, Aaron heard a low, rhythmic vibration, a deep tremor, as if massive structures were being forced to stand against forces they were never meant to bear. He paused the playback. The room seemed louder in the silence that followed. The hum of the air recycler in the ceiling. The faint tick of cooling metal in the walls. He pulled a tablet closer and began sketching. He drew a horizontal line for his own timeline. On it, he marked the day of TBI-01 with a red slash. A few years later, he marked the present. Then, above it, he drew a second line. The same red slash sat there too. In that version of events, the gate experiment had hurt someone, shaken the complex, burned a scar along a corridor wall. Only there, the person on the gurney had not been under a sheet. He marked that point in gray instead of black. From that spot, the upper line continued. Somewhere along it, he drew a small circle and labeled it with a single initial, D. Phase mirrored, he murmured. Two lifelines, nearly identical until one decision, far above his pay grade, sent them down slightly different slopes. He linked the present point on his line to a spot on the upper line with a thin, curved stroke. That's the corridor, he said, the decoherence layer, right when both versions of the gate dance through the same configuration. If both gates reached that state within a few milliseconds of one another, the equation said, information could jump sideways. Nothing mystical, just the math of fields and phases, pushed harder than any sane engineer would recommend. On the upper line, he added a small arrow pointing from the circle marked D toward the corridor. In that other layer, a boy who had not died in a corridor blast had lived long enough to watch his world break. He had grown up under skies laced with shimmering scars and cities that flickered in and out of power. At some point, he had learned enough about the machine that caused it to aim his voice into the one place where it might break free of his doomed slope. Not a ghost, Aaron said quietly. Not a miracle. Data, routed through a crack in causality. Because some older, desperate version of his son refused to let the same mistake repeat unanswered. He leaned back. The grief that moved through him now was different from the crushing weight that had followed TBI-01. This one carried a direction. It pointed forward, not back. The warning did not give him a way to bring Daniel back. It gave him something else, a responsibility. You tried, he said to the empty room. You did more than anyone had a right to ask of you. The terminal screen stayed blank. The recording waited in its buffer. 20 seconds of proof that the universe was less simple and less kind than the textbooks had promised. He saved the updated model to his private archive and encrypted it twice. Then he keyed in a new query to Helix 9's core systems, requesting deeper access to historical gate logs, field drift records, and unreleased safety simulations. He knew it would trip flags. He sent it anyway. The flags did their job. 2 days later, Aaron sat in a smaller room than the council chamber. But the air felt heavier. The walls here were plain. The lighting flatter. No grand projections. No maps of dying power grids. Just a table, 3 chairs, and a slim console built into the surface. Director Karen Holt occupied the chair across from him. To her right sat a man in a Strategic Oversight Command uniform, Lieutenant Jonas Vale. If Aaron remembered the name correctly from briefings, Vale's posture was attentive without being aggressive. A professional soldier used to watching complicated disasters unfold from the inside. The console between them glowed with a list of access events. Aaron's ID sat highlighted more often than anyone else's. Holt tapped one of the entries with a fingertip. "You requested restricted logs from the early gate prototypes," she said. "You tried to pull raw sensor feeds from TBI-01, which are under sealed review. You cross-linked them with the Echo 20 analysis and 3 different internal models of temporal drift. That is a great deal of activity for someone whose official mandate is limited to preparing updated stability recommendations." Her tone was neutral. It did not need to be sharp. "I needed more context," Aaron said. "The message doesn't exist in a vacuum. Neither do the risks." "You had context," Holt said. "We gave you as much as anyone has seen outside the incident committee. The rest is locked away for reasons that have not changed. Those reasons include protecting reputations," Aaron said. Vale shifted slightly, but Holt did not look away. "Careful," she said. He met her gaze. "You brought me back into this program because you knew I would not lie to you about what the math says. Let me do that job." "You are not standing here as a free agent," Holt said. "You are standing here as an employee of HELIX-9. Under the oversight of the Global Energy Council and Strategic Oversight Command. When you move outside the lines, the system notices." Vale cleared his throat. "Dr. Rhee," he said, "from an operational standpoint, we have to consider other possibilities. The Echo 20 message could be a fabrication. It could be interference. It could even be an intentional injection from an adversary trying to steer our energy policy." Aaron turned to him. "You heard the analysis," he said. "You saw the voice match, the noise profile, the environmental metadata. That would require a level of access to our archives and a level of modeling sophistication we haven't seen from any outside actor. Or from any actor you know about," Vale said. "I'm not saying that's what it is. I'm saying we cannot let one data point, however persuasive, dictate decisions that affect the entire planet." Holt brought up another projection on the console. This one was not about ECHO-20. It was a cluster of lines, each representing a simulation outcome. Some spiraled down into failure. Some leveled off at marginal stability. A few climbed toward bands marked as sufficient yield. "These are our updated scenarios," she said. "In some of them, opening the gate goes badly. In others, it works. Nothing in the models says we are doomed to repeat whatever your alternate son saw." "You're treating his world as an outlier," Aaron said. "We're treating it as a branch," Holt replied. "A path through possibility space. A path that may exist, but that we are not obligated to walk. The fact that he came from there does not make his trajectory binding here." She folded her hands. "You of all people understand that. The existence of a phase-mirrored timeline is not proof of inevitable fate. It is proof that there are choices." Aaron felt his jaw tighten. "And your choice," he said, "is to assume that if we are clever enough, we can have the energy without the collapse. Our choice," Holt said, "is to weigh the near certainty of slow catastrophe against the theoretical risk of a fast one. If we do nothing, we know what happens. The grids fail. The hospitals go dark. The most vulnerable die first. If we proceed, we take a managed risk with the best tools and knowledge available." Vale nodded. "From where I sit," he said, "failing to act is its own kind of decision. And it kills people just as surely. Only less visibly." Holt leaned back. "We are not blind to what the echo implies," she said. "We are not dismissing it. That is why we brought you in. That is why we are asking you to help strengthen the chrono-stability lattice. So that when we open the gate, we do it with more control than whoever tried it in that other layer." She tapped the console again. Aaron's access log shrank, replaced by a new authorization document. "From this point forward," she said, "your activities will be monitored more closely. Strategic Oversight Command will have a mirror of your workspace. Certain archives remain closed, but your formal responsibilities increase. You will lead the stability design for the next activation sequence." Aaron stared at the document. His name sat at the top of the roll list. Under it, the words, "Primary Stability Architect, Temporal Gate Array." "You want me to build the cage," he said, "while you decide how far to poke the beast inside it. We want you to make sure that if the beast wakes up, it does not break the world," Holt said. "And if that is not possible?" he asked. "Then we will know it," she said, "from you, and we will make decisions with that knowledge. But I will not let you sabotage this project from the shadows because you cannot separate your grief from your equations." The sentence landed heavy, but it was not said with cruelty. It was a diagnosis. Vale powered down the console. "Doctor," he said, "the next phase begins in weeks, not months. Whether we like it or not, I would rather have someone in your position who is afraid of the wrong outcome than someone who is only chasing glory." It was a compromise, of a sort. Supervision and responsibility, bound together. Aaron signed the authorization. His throat felt dry. When he looked up, Holt's expression had not changed. She did not look satisfied. She looked like someone who had just locked a necessary piece of machinery into place. As they left the room, a notification pinged silently on his wrist terminal. Access restrictions updated. Role updated. Primary Stability Architect, TGA. Flag. User under active oversight, Society. Helix 9's corridors felt narrower than usual as he walked back to his lab. They had given him more power than he wanted and less freedom than he needed. They had pulled him closer to the heart of the machine that had killed his son and, somewhere else, given that same boy a reason to send a warning across the fractured layer of time. Whatever came next, he would be standing at the console when the gate opened. The first time the disaster appeared on a screen, it was only numbers. The modeling bay sat on the upper ring of HELIX 9. Just beneath the reinforcement that separated concrete from rock. It held no windows, only a row of wide displays that could turn data into landscapes. On most days, those walls showed idealized graphs and neat weather plots, polite shapes for committees to nod at. Today, Aaron had locked the room to everyone except his core team. "Run the first set," he said. The simulation engine acknowledged with a low chime. Echo 20's metadata and the derived environment from the other layer flowed into the solver. Pressure, field shape, radiation spectrum, the signature of a gate driven well beyond their current thresholds. A wireframe model of a planet snapped into place on the central wall. At first it looked like any textbook Earth: blue oceans, bands of cloud, glow of city lights on the night side. "This is baseline," said one of the systems modelers. A woman named Kira with 2 kids topside. Unperturbed, with current depletion but no gate. She tapped a control. A second copy of the world appeared beside the first. Its upper atmosphere highlighted in faint green. A small marker indicated Helix 9's approximate location. "When we inject the gate," Kira went on, "we feed in an energy source with the same frequency and general structure as what we reconstructed from Echo 20's environment. Scaled to their measured values. Then we watch what happens over the next 10 years. Model time." "Do it," Aaron said. The simulation clock started. At first, very little change. The gate's opening appeared as a localized distortion in the magnetic field above Helix 9's coordinates. Power curves ticked upward. The global energy deficit shrank. The red bands on the resource map retreating. "This is the part the council likes," Mara murmured from behind him. On the world projection, city lights brightened in poor regions. Power reservoirs filled. Hospitals that had been on rotating outage schedules stayed lit. "Watch the upper layers," Aaron said quietly. As the modeled years advanced, a ring of intensified field gradients formed high above the atmosphere. They pulsed in time with the gates cycling. At each pulse, a tiny fraction of power came from somewhere that was not the visible universe. The system kept borrowing. After a while, the ring thickened. The simulation zoomed in. The green band that represented the upper atmosphere developed knot-like structures. Some dissolved harmlessly. Others persisted and slowly bled down toward the surface like threads of shimmering frost. "What is that?" Kira asked. "Information exchange," Aaron said. "Not just energy. We're not just pulling raw power. We're letting the gate trade states with whatever it is coupled to." He pointed at a graph off to the side. the one tracking what the solver called causal variance. It should have stayed near zero, with only tiny fluctuations. It was climbing. Past threshold X, he said. The gate stops behaving like a one-way pump. It becomes a bridge between two different evolutions of the same space. That means not just fields. It means patterns. Patterns like what? Kira asked. Like configurations of satellite orbits. Stress lines in the crust. Atmospheric flows. Aaron said. You don't move that much power without giving the other side a chance to push back in ways we didn't intend. The modeled years ticked forward. In orbit, the satellite network began to drift. A few units experienced unplanned changes in drag. Small corrections burned extra fuel. Some failed early. Gaps opened in the communication mesh. The solver colored them in dark patches. On the surface, a section of the resource map flickered. One industrial belt, once bright with power, dimmed and stayed that way. Transmission lines in the region began to show overload markers. The simulation highlighted them in yellow. Then orange. Rerouting, Kira said. Following the logic, grid control tries to compensate. They pull more power from other sectors. Push it through lines that were never meant for this load. And each correction pushes the gate harder. Aaron said, because the optimization algorithms keep asking it for more. Storm tracks widened on the planetary map. Clouds took on elongated, twisted shapes. The weather engine, coupled to the evolving fields, produced patterns that no longer matched historical records. A band of severe storms set up over a continent and refused to move for months. Flood indicators lit along major river systems. Weather isn't supposed to lock like that, said another analyst. Not without a driver, Aaron said. The driver is in the upper atmosphere. The knots we saw are dumping structured energy into the air. They're tuning the flows whether we want them to or not. The simulation clock advanced again. Noise crept into the signal from orbital sensors. Small, bright points appeared in the field map, tiny hot spots where something like radiation flared without a corresponding source below. The solver annotated them automatically. Temporal leak candidate. Confidence 0.78. Temporal leak candidate. Confidence 0.83. Those are the first leaks, Aaron said. Places where the gate's influence is no longer confined to the engineered channel. They're pinpricks where time itself is fraying. They're small, Kira said weakly. They don't stay small, Mara replied. As the modeled decade drew to a close, those pinpricks became clusters. Entire regions on the globe turned into a patchwork of normal and abnormal physics. Communication signals experienced strange delays. Some messages arrived before they were sent, in the limited sense that routers logged acknowledgments out of expected order. Hardware and software, built for a saner world, misinterpreted the noise. The city lights began to go out. Not in random scatterings, but in blocks. Once the local systems crossed a certain threshold of inconsistent input, control logic failed. Operators made mistakes. Maintenance crews could not keep pace with cascades they did not understand. In the end state, the model froze. One world glowed with a ragged halo of active satellites and patchy ground lights. The other, the one that had opened the gate and leaned on it too hard, lay under a sky ringed with unstable fields. Its cities were dim. Whole industrial belts showed as cold gray scars. The overlay of temporal leak candidates formed constellations where nothing on the surface had ever been built. No warheads had fallen. No enemy fleets had fired. The damage had come from within. Kira's hands fell away from the controls. We ran this with conservative assumptions, she said quietly. This is the best case that still includes a sustained gate. It fits the environmental trace from the other layer, Aaron said. The pressure, the heat, the field profile, all of it points to a world that used the gate as a lifeline until the rope wound around its neck. No one spoke for several seconds. Mara broke the silence. We can vary the parameters a little, she said. Dial the gate down, schedule shorter cycles. We might be able to soften some of the edges, but the core behavior isn't going to change without a completely different architecture. And we don't have time to invent one, Kira said, not with the grids up there falling apart. Aaron stared at the dimmed planet on the screen. That, he said, is the layer he called from. He did not say his son's name. He did not need to. The room knew. They did not show those simulations to the council. At first, Aaron tried to keep the results within a small circle. He gathered the team who had been closest to the modeling work in one of the briefing rooms, Mara, Kira, and 3 others from the stability group. The room was narrow, with a long table and a display occupying most of one wall. Above it, a strip of inert metal marked where a window might have been in a kinder building. "We will go through it once," he said, "and then we decide what reaches the upper levels." He simplified the visuals, stripping away the most speculative overlays. No dramatic colors, just clear transitions. A world with a gate ramping up. A world with a gate left on too long, the slow unspooling of infrastructure. When the sequence ended, he turned the display off entirely so they would not all sit and stare at the ruins as if they were watching a newsfeed. Kira was the first to speak. "I have 2 children who think power cuts are exciting," she said, "because candles are different, and the dark is an adventure. Watching that, I realized they would not grow up in that world. They would grow up in one where the dark never leaves." Her knuckles were pale where her hands gripped the edge of the table. Across from her, one of the other analysts, a man named Rhee, shook his head. "You're assuming that the model is right," he said, "every part of it, that the solver didn't miss ways the system might protect itself. We tuned it as carefully as we could." Aaron said, "I'm not claiming prophetic accuracy. I am saying that the structure of the equations is stable. The pattern is robust." Rhee snorted softly. "Patterns don't feed people," he said. "Right now, our grids are failing in the real world. Not in a simulation. If we do nothing, we know what happens. Hospitals lose power. Farms lose water. The curve is already against us. That's not a model. That's the daily report." Kira looked at him. "You would risk turning the whole planet into that?" she asked, jerking her chin toward the blank screen. "I would risk trying not to watch my parents freeze," Rhee said. "Your kids have you in a complex like this. Mine don't." The room tightened around the words. Mara raised a hand slightly. "This is the fracture line," she said, "between people who fear the slow disaster more than the fast one. And people who fear the reverse. The council is full of the first kind. They wake up every morning with numbers that say how many more days the grids have. They will not stop because we show them a possible collapse. They already live in a certain one." Aaron knew she was right. "That's why we have to be precise," he said. "We can't go upstairs with a hysterical warning. We go with structure, with the thresholds, with the idea that we might step back from them." "And if they don't?" Kira asked. "Then we decide what we can live with," Aaron said. They did not leave him much time to decide. The formal review came 2 days later. This time, the room was larger than the internal briefing but smaller than the council chamber. Representatives from the Global Energy Council sat on one side of the table, flanked by advisors. On the other side, Helix 9's leadership, Director Karen Holt, several division heads, and Aaron as the designated stability expert. Lieutenant Jonas Vale occupied a seat at the end, eyes taking everything in. A reduced version of the simulation played on the main display, one of the middle runs. Not the most catastrophic, but bad enough to make the point. Aaron had trimmed away the speculative markers. What remained was stark. The gate providing relief at first. Then the long slide as emergent behavior overtook design. And as you can see, he finished. Once the gate is operated beyond threshold X for more than a few years, the system begins to show signs of uncontrolled cross-coupling with the environment it is linked to. The failure modes are global, gradual, and extremely difficult to reverse. A council member with tired eyes and a neat beard leaned forward. "Begins to show," he said. "You are talking about a model." "Yes," Aaron said, "a model constrained by measurements from a world that already went through this process." "You're referring to the echo," the man said, "the message from the alternate layer." "Yes," Aaron said again, "its metadata matches the end state of this simulation very closely." Director Holt folded her hands. "What Dr. Rhee has given us," she said, "is a map of the cliff we might be walking toward. It is valuable. It helps us identify guardrails. But it is not a guarantee that stepping forward leads to the same fall." Aaron felt the choice of words land between them. "We're not talking about a cliff," he said. We are talking about a slope. Once we go far enough down it, climbing back up becomes harder than most political structures can manage. A murmur ran down the council's side of the table. Another representative, a woman with a data band on her wrist, spoke. We cannot ignore the other trajectory, she said, the one where we do nothing. In that line, we know deaths accumulate steadily as infrastructure decays. We have the casualty projections. They are not hypothetical. They are already visible in Syrian Plateau, in North Meridian, in every region that cannot keep lights on. Holt nodded. A single possible future in which the gate eventually destabilizes the world, she said, must be weighed against a very real, very present future in which millions die over the next decades because we refused to act. She looked at Aaron. Your work tells us where the danger lies, she said. It does not tell us to abandon the tool entirely. It tells us how careful we must be. It tells us that if we push past certain points, we may not know we have crossed them until we are committed. Aaron replied, there is no line on the ground we can see with our eyes. We have you, Holt said, you, and people like you, watching the instruments. And if those instruments report that we are following the same track as the world that sent the echo, he asked. Then the council will revisit its decisions, Holt said smoothly, with the understanding that inaction kills as surely as miscalculation. The bearded council member spread his hands. No one here is eager to gamble, he said. We are already gambling by waking up each morning and hoping the grids hold. You ask us to be cautious about a hypothetical collapse. We ask you to be realistic about an actual one. The subtext was clear. To them, the simulations were warnings, not prohibitions. In the final summary, Aaron's models were marked as critical for monitoring, but not determinative for policy. His recommendation to redesign the gate architecture from the ground up was noted and shelved. The decision to proceed with limited activation remained in place. At the end of the session, Jonas Vale caught up with him in the corridor. They didn't like the pictures, Jonas said. They liked them enough to pretend they'll remember them, Aaron replied. Jonas walked beside him for a moment. They are not wrong about the slow deaths, the officer said. I've seen the hospitals, the brownouts, the ration lines. I know, Aaron said. That's what makes this harder than physics. A notification buzzed on his wrist. Access privileges modified. Data tiers reduced. Role status maintained. They're cutting you down, Jonas said, glancing at his own display. They still need someone to stand next to the machine when it spins up. Aaron said, someone to blame if it goes wrong. The gate did not look like a door. From the control room, it resembled a wound in the air. Helix 9's activation chamber was a vast cylinder cut straight down into the rock. The core of the temporal gate array hung in its center, a lattice of alloy rings, field projectors, and containment coils arranged like the skeleton of a collapsed star. Cables and conduits ran to it from the walls in bundled streams. On the day of the first limited activation, the chamber was crowded with equipment and people. Technicians in pale suits moved along the catwalks. In the control room above, separated by thick glass and layers of shielding, Aaron stood at the primary console. Mara occupied the neighboring station. Director Holt watched from a raised platform at the back, arms resting lightly on the rail. Expression unreadable. Jonas Vale stood near the door. In uniform, silent. Final status, Aaron said. Field coils at nominal temperature. Mara replied. Power feed stable. Chrono stability lattice loaded and verified. External grid link? He asked. Connected, another engineer said. Draw set to minimal. This is a proof of concept, not a harvest. Aaron took a breath. Begin phase 1, he said. Deep below, the array answered. Power surged through the coils. The screens in front of him filled with shifting graphs, field strengths, phase offsets, containment margins. In the chamber, air shimmered around the core framework. Light bent, not in a dramatic flare, but in a subtle wrongness. The edges of the metal seemed to slide sideways by fractions of a degree when he tried to focus on them. The gate is forming, Mara said. Phase offset within predicted band. On one of the secondary monitors, a live feed showed the activation chamber from above. The structure at the center glowed faintly now. Not from heat, but from the way it redirected light. Aaron watched the line tracking the gate's effective radius. It climbed toward the marker he had labeled X, the limit their models had screamed about. "We hold well below threshold," he said. "No excursions, no bravado." "Understood," Mara said. The radius line leveled off. The chrono-stability lattice did its work, damping oscillations, smoothing the worst edges of the field. For the first time, a channel existed in front of him that touched something beyond his own timeline. On the grid interface, a tiny uptick registered. The external power draw dipped as the system began feeding from the gate instead. "Look at that," said one of the engineers. "We're actually doing it." "It's a trickle," Aaron said. "That's all it is today." Holt's voice came from the back of the room. "A trickle can prove the river is real," she said. For a few seconds, everything held. Then a warning indicator flickered on a peripheral display. "Seeing a phase spike on secondary band," Mara said. Her voice remained calm, but Aaron heard the tightness underneath. "Magnitude small, but shape is off." "Location?" Aaron asked. "Not in the main channel," she said. "It's in the decoherence layer around it, like something brushed the edge of the corridor." Another alert chimed in quick succession. "Visual feed is picking up artifacts," a technician said. On the chamber monitor, the image stuttered. For an instant, the frame split into horizontal bands. The central structure seemed to double. One copy misaligned with the other by a narrow distance. Between the bands, a landscape flashed. Jagged outlines of towers under a sky laced with pale arcs of light. Wind howled across the open space, carrying dust or ash in roiling sheets. Then the image snapped back. The chamber floor and catwalks returned. "What was that?" Jonas asked. "Cross-contamination," Aaron said through his teeth. "We just saw through to the other side." "Field variance rising," Mara said. "We're getting unplanned feedback in the peripheral coils." "Shut it down," Aaron said. "Phase ramp down, now." In the chamber, one of the technicians, positioned on a lower catwalk to monitor physical readings, staggered. His meter slipped from his hand. The rail in front of him vibrated, then kicked, as if struck by an invisible hammer. A ripple moved through the air. A wave whose crest lit up dust motes in a harsh, white edge. The man went down hard. Thrown against the metal, his body hit the grate with a sound that Aaron felt in his own bones. "Medical team to activation chamber," someone called. The gate's radii started to collapse as the lattice forced the fields down. The shimmer around the core dimmed, then disappeared. The monitors returned to ordinary readings. Aaron's palms were damp on the console surface. He did not realize he had moved until he found himself pushing through the control room door. Jonas on his heels. Holt's voice said his name, but he did not stop. By the time they reached the activation chamber's viewing level, med techs were already on the catwalk with the injured man. He lay on his side. One arm bent under him at an angle that said something had broken. Blood trickled from his nose. His eyes were open, unfocused, staring at a point somewhere between the decking and the void. "Pulse?" a medic asked. "Fast," the other replied. "Pressure dropping. Get the stretcher up here." Aaron gripped the railing. For a second, the scene blurred. It overlapped with another in his memory, a different corridor. A different fall. A smaller body being lifted onto a gurney. The sheet had come up too quickly then. Now, there was no sheet, only a mask pressed over a face. A line snaking from an arm. Monitors chirping. The tech was alive, but for how long, Aaron could not say. "We were under threshold," Mara said quietly beside him. She had followed them down. The lattice did not register a full breach. "It didn't have to," Aaron said. "We brushed against the same instability. The same kind of echo. And it reached up and hit someone who was standing exactly where my son had stood years ago." "Coincidence," Jonas said, but his voice lacked conviction. "There's nothing coincidental about the way we are driving this machine," Aaron said. "We're steering into a region of behavior that another world already proved is lethal." Down on the catwalk, the med team lifted the injured technician onto a stretcher. As they turned, his hand twitched, reaching weakly toward the center of the chamber. Aaron did not know if the man was reaching for help, or for the thing that had struck him. He knew only that the line between his own timeline and the ruined one had just gotten thinner. Later, alone in his office, he replayed the glitch frame by frame. The system had captured enough. The towers in the brief overlay were dark, their outlines jagged where pieces had fallen away. The sky carried faint arcs, the same structures he had seen in the simulation's upper field maps. Drawn now with brutal clarity. The wind disturbed something on the ground. For a fraction of a second, the camera caught a swirl of ash or snow that moved too fast and too straight to be weather, bending instead along lines of warped physics. The metadata on the image confirmed his suspicion. Field profile match. Echo 20 environment. Confidence 0.94. Temporal offset. Non-local. Causal variance index. Elevated. He leaned back. The first time he had seen that broken world, it had been as a model. Numbers given a skin. Now, he had seen a slice of the actual place through his own eyes. Courtesy of a machine he was helping to hold together. Earth was not there yet. Outside, his own sky, if he had gone up to see it, would still be mostly ordinary. But the machine that had carved that scar into another layer of reality was humming again. In the same pit, under the same ground. Echo 20 was not a warning from a far-off branch no one would ever reach. It was a postcard from the end of a road they had already begun to walk. He closed the display. Whatever excuses the council had clung to about speculative risk had just lost one more layer of comfort. And if they chose to ignore that, then the responsibility for what happened next would not belong only to them. It would belong to the man who stayed in the room and kept the lattice running while the gate widened. He set his hands flat on the desk. "If they will not stop," he said softly, "then I have to make sure they cannot get where they're trying to go." The thought was treasonous in every legal sense. In every other sense that mattered to him now. It was the only sane conclusion left. The file should not have existed. Aaron sat alone in one of Helix 9's archival rooms. A narrow space 3 levels below the main server bay. The air smelled of dust and cold metal. Along the walls, racks of older storage units blinked their slow, indifferent lights. These were the machines that had been deemed too expensive to decommission and too old to trust with current secrets. Perfect for forgotten ones. He had traced a reference to the file through a chain of obsolete audit logs. The kind most administrators never looked at unless something broke. TBIO1 raw buffer. The label said, "Access restricted, legacy format." The console on the central desk was older than the one in his office. The keys clicked instead of whispering. When he entered his credentials, the system hesitated, then responded with a grudging green. The file opened into a flood of numbers. Timestamps scrolled past, followed by sensor readings, field strengths, gradient maps, error flags. The markers for the moment of the accident were familiar. He had seen the smooth, edited versions in a dozen internal reviews. These were not smooth. He narrowed the window around the critical seconds. Graphs redrew themselves, jagged and raw. The primary field showed the expected spike as the prototype gate surged. The containment margin dropped, then recovered, then dropped again. He almost skipped past the secondary channel. It had been labeled ancillary diagnostics in the official summary. Something in the pattern caught his eye. A low amplitude oscillation appeared there. Just before the main spike. It grew in a regular rhythm, not matching any of the drive functions. It carried the same shape he had seen in modern leak candidates. He pulled that channel out and overlaid it with the temporal variance traces from the recent simulation runs. The fit was ugly and precise. "Leak behavior," he said under his breath. "We saw this the first time." Further down, he found tags from a junior engineer. The notes were terse. The way they always became under pressure. Unexpected field deviation. Correlates with predicted decoherence zone. Recommend full stop and model review before next activation. The timestamp on that comment was 4 minutes before the accident. The official report he had read years ago contained no mention of any such recommendation. He kept scrolling. The next entry was 3 days later. The author line had changed. The language had changed too. Unexpected field deviation, non-repeatable anomaly. Cause: transient hardware glitch. No causal risk identified. Someone had gone back and rewritten the record. He leaned back in the chair. The room felt smaller. Slowly, he opened another file, a compressed bundle of internal messages from that same week. Most were routine. Buried in the thread was a chain between the then director of Helix 9 and the oversight liaison at the council. The names were different, but one caught his attention. C. Holt, operations lead. Her earlier signature, a decade younger. We have a casualty. One of the messages read, 1 fatality, several injuries, technical analysis ongoing, but early signs point to design flaws in the energy routing. If we present this as a fundamental risk, the entire initiative will be frozen for years, if not permanently. The reply was short. We cannot afford to lose this line of research. Frame as isolated hardware failure. Emphasize corrective measures. Do not speculate about structural temporal risk in writing. Another message followed, flagged as urgent. The modeling team raised concerns about causal shear and non-local stress. These terms will be seized on by risk-averse factions if they appear in any form beyond internal notes. The response. Then they will not appear. Below that, a final line. The death is regrettable, but we must be clear-eyed about what is at stake. He stared at that sentence until the words blurred. Regrettable. A polite word for a child with a sheet over his face. They had seen the same fractures he was seeing now. They had seen some early echo of the same leak behavior. And they had chosen to fold it back into a narrative the council could swallow. He scrolled further down the chain. One more message, this one signed by Karen Holt herself. We proceed. The note read, the alternative is letting this world starve in slow motion. He closed his eyes. They had looked at the first crack in time and decided to step on it. By the time he reached Mara's office, hours had passed, though it felt like minutes. Helix 9's artificial day cycle had shifted. The corridor lights were cooler. The ambient noise quieter. People spoke in lower voices, as if the whole complex knew instinctively that it had crossed a line with the last activation. Mara was at her desk, surrounded by stacked printouts and an empty mug. She looked up when he entered. The fatigue in her face sharpened when she saw his expression. What did you find? She asked. He dropped a data stick on her desk. Raw buffer from TBI-01, he said, with annotations, and a message chain between the old director and oversight. Holt was in those threads. She knew. Mara slotted the stick into her console. The screen filled with the same jagged graphs he had seen downstairs. She skimmed the notes, the edits, the tidy erasures. When she reached the line about the death being regrettable, she stopped. How long have they been sitting on this? She asked. Since the day they buried my son, he said. She exhaled slowly. Then the leak we saw at the last activation was not a new class of problem. She said, it was the same one coming back, scaled up. And the same people making the same choice. Aaron said, they put the project above the person once. They will do it again. Only now the person is the planet. Mara leaned back. An apology won't fix that, she said. They are not going to apologize. Aaron said, they are going to keep talking about necessity and sacrifice until the math drowns under the rhetoric. He sat down across from her. I can't talk them out of this, he said. We've tried numbers. We've tried models. We've shown them the other world's ruin. They weigh it against the slow collapse they already see. And they decide the bet is worth it. So what's left? She asked. He looked at the door. Then back at her. We make sure the machine fails, he said, on our terms. The plan took shape in whispers and code. They met in odd corners of the complex, a quiet instrumentation lab between shifts. A maintenance bay while a coolant conduit hummed. The circle stayed small, too many people and someone would lean under the wrong kind of pressure. Mara, because she knew the lattice as well as he did. Kira, because she had seen the simulations and had children who would live or die with the outcome. A systems engineer named Tomas, whose talent for hiding corrections in plain sight had kept a dozen upgrades from crashing on rollout. The goal is not to blow it up, Aaron said the first time they were all in the same room. We do not want another TBI-01 on a larger scale. The goal is to make the gate look like a bad investment. How? Tomas asked. On paper, It already is a bad investment. They're only here because they're desperate. Right now, they're desperate in theory, Aaron said. They still believe in the promise of a breakthrough. We have to turn that promise into a disappointment. He brought up a schematic of the chronostability lattice on a handheld display. Waves of color traced how the lattice responded to rising field intensity. Smoothing spikes, keeping the gate's edges from tearing into the surrounding time. We can add a secondary response layer, he said, one that only activates once the field passes a certain internal marker. Not the formal threshold X. A little below that. And when it triggers? Kira asked. It alters the feedback curves, he said, subtly enough that it doesn't look like sabotage. The gate stays stable. It doesn't leak, but the conversion efficiency drops. The more they lean on it to pull energy, the less they get. So every time they try to scale up, Mara said slowly, the returns flatten. Exactly, Aaron said. It will look, from the outside, like a fundamental limitation, not a failure of will. Not something they can fix by throwing more money or more soldiers at it. Tomas rubbed his jaw. They'll audit the code, he said. The lattice is critical. There are integrity checks. Then we hide it in a place no one thinks to look. Aaron said, not in the main algorithms. In the calibration routines. In the part of the system that adjusts to sensor drift and hardware aging. Self-tuning, Tomas said. So when auditors see it changing parameters, they think it is just doing its job. Mara nodded slowly. If we succeed, she said, the worst case is that the project is labeled a white elephant. Too costly for the little it gives. They shift funding back to more conventional solutions. And if we fail? Kira asked. Then the gate behaves as originally designed, Aaron said, which we already know ends badly. It was not honest comfort. But it was the only scale he had left. They spent the next week threading the new layer into the lattice. Most of the work happened under cover of legitimate tasks, updating response curves, refining filters, pushing minor patches, the hidden pieces hid inside abstractions, small branches of code that only became meaningful in combination. From time to time, system checks threw warnings. Tomas massaged them until they looked like the usual turbulence of a complex upgrade. One evening, while they were testing the modified routines in a sandbox environment, a new warning flashed on Aaron's console. Unauthorized modification detected, Control Bus Omega. Source: Defense Override Pathway. Status: Active, Privilege Channel. He frowned. What is that? Mara asked, leaning over his shoulder. He expanded the warning. A diagram of the gate's control architecture appeared, highlighting a narrow band of connections he had seen only in outline before. The defense override pathway ran alongside the standard control bus like a second nervous system. It bypassed several of the subsystems they were altering, connecting instead to a separate module buried in the array's core. The label on that module was unhelpful. Secure Execution Core, authorization required. Jonas mentioned additional oversight once. Mara said, I thought he meant logging and mirrors. This is more than that. Aaron said, this is a parallel command line. He pulled up the documentation he could reach. Most of it was redacted. The pieces that remained described a set of emergency commands that could be issued by Strategic Oversight Command in crisis scenarios. Commands that could force the gate to operate under parameters different from those defined in the main configuration. Can they turn off the modifications we're making? Kira asked. Not directly, Aaron said. They don't know where they are. But they can reroute around the lattice. Or push the gate into regimes we never signed off on. In other words, Tomas said, if they decide the tool is worth any price, they have a way to ignore the brakes we're installing. Aaron stared at the glowing lines. They built a weaponized back door. He said, of course they did. Do we stop? Mara asked. He thought of the simulations. Of the injured technician on the catwalk. Of Daniel's voice, shredded by static but still clear enough to say no. No, he said, we finish the work. The override gives them a way to make everything worse. That was true before we started. At least now. If they hesitate and try to play within the rules, the machine will undercut them. And if they don't hesitate? Kira asked. Then we will need another plan. He said. They did not get as much time as they hoped. The summons came sooner than Aaron expected. In the middle of a routine calibration session, his wrist terminal buzzed with a high-priority notice. Director Holt, mandatory meeting. Location: Level 1 secure briefing room. Attend. Drive. Aaron Rhee. Mara caught the look on his face. Go, she said. I'll keep an eye on this. The secure briefing room was compact, with walls lined in dark acoustic panels. A single table sat in the center. Director Holt waited there, alone, a tablet in front of her. The room's recorder light glowed steady red. Aaron, she said, sit down. He did. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she tapped the tablet, rotating it so he could see the display. It showed a section of code from the stability subsystem. Comments stripped, variable names generic, highlighted segments traced a path through the calibration routines. Someone had done a careful, thorough audit. Would you like to explain this? Holt asked. He kept his face still. It's an adjustment to the lattice feedback, he said, to reduce the risk of runaway amplification once the field enters nonlinear regimes. The official version, she said, would have made that change in the main algorithm, where it belongs. This version hides the critical behavior in adaptive routines that are not part of the documented design. She tilted her head. That kind of concealment is usually reserved for hostile actors. He met her gaze. Hostile to what? He asked. To the gate? Or to the world that has to live under it? Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes cooled. You are not being prosecuted, she said. If we wanted to charge you with sabotage, this conversation would look different. We are here because I still believe you can be part of the solution. The solution you are aiming at, he said, ends with a planet that looks like the one in the Echo. We have been over this, she said. You showed us a model driven by worst-case assumptions. And then the gate brushed that reality. He said, you saw the same frames I did. The towers, the scars in the sky, the air itself twisted. She let the words settle, then shook her head. I do not dismiss the risk, she said. I never have, but I live in the same world you do. Every month, the reports from the surface get worse. Grid failures, crop losses, people freezing in their homes because there is nothing left to burn. We are losing the slow war. And you intend to replace it with a fast one, he said. I intend, she said, to give us a chance at something other than managed decline. She leaned forward. If we do nothing, the world breaks apart over decades. Billions suffer and die, and there is no energy miracle coming from old reactors and wind farms. If we open the gate, we create the possibility of a different outcome. Yes, there is danger. Yes, there is a chance that we repeat the mistakes of that other layer. But there is also a chance that we do better. And who gets to decide that the chance is worth the risk? He asked. You, the council? Did you ask the boy who died under your watch if he thought his life was an acceptable cost of keeping the initiative alive? For the first time, a crack appeared in her composure. You found the old files, she said. Yes, he said. I saw how the warnings were softened, how the language was changed so the council could look away. I saw your name on the chain. You knew that the first leak was not just a hardware glitch. You helped bury it. She did not flinch. I was younger, she said, less cautious, more arrogant, perhaps, but not blind. I knew, even then, that if we presented every unknown as a fatal flaw, the work would die, and with it, any hope of avoiding the situation we are in now. Daniel was not a concept, Aaron said. He was not a line item in a cost-benefit analysis. He was a person. Holt's voice dropped. I know exactly what he was, she said. I watched the med reports. I saw your face in the corridor. I have replayed those minutes in my head more times than you would believe. Her gaze hardened again. But I also know that if we had shut it all down then, we would be facing the same grid collapse now with nothing in our hands except regret. Instead, we have a tool, imperfect, dangerous, but real, and you are trying to break it because you are afraid of making the same mistake twice. I am afraid of killing a world, he said. I am afraid of ignoring a warning that cost another version of my son everything to send. She sat back. There is another way to see it, she said. He sent that warning because he thought there was still a version of this story where we listen and adjust. Not one where we run away and hide. If we shut the gate down forever, we may honor his fear, but we betray his effort. Silence settled between them. Finally, she tapped the tablet again. The code vanished, replaced by a new display, a schedule, a set of parameters, a status line. TGA activation, full-scale event. Mode: Defense override. Authorization: GEC, Society Joint Directive. Countdown: 11 days. I argued for a staged escalation. Holt said, "They overruled me. The Strategic Oversight Command believes we are approaching a point of no return in several key regions. They want a decisive test, with real yield." "You can say no," Aaron said. "I already did," she replied. "This is the compromise. They use the defense override pathway to control the gate parameters directly. In return, Helix 9 retains some authority over preparation and monitoring. Without that, they would take it completely away from us and run it from orbit." He imagined the gate, unmoored from even the minimal restraint he could offer, run by distant officers with less patience for nuance than Jonas. "You can refuse to help," he said. "And let someone else do a worse job in your place?" she asked. "Someone who has not stared into the ruined sky you showed us. Would that satisfy your conscience?" He did not answer. "The override channel will bypass portions of the lattice," she said. "You know that now. Your hidden layer will still have some effect, but not enough to stop a determined push. You can continue to refine it. Make it as strong as you can. Or you can walk away and watch the machine spin up under the hands of people who think stability is a luxury." She folded her hands on the table. "I am not your enemy, Aaron," she said. "I am someone who made a choice. Years ago. And is still making it. The choice to fight for a future that is not just a slower collapse. And I am someone," he said, "who has seen what happens when that choice leaves the rails." Her eyes flicked to the schedule on the screen. "You have 11 days," she said. "Use them. Strengthen the lattice. Prepare contingencies. If you have a better way to live with the gate, show it to me. But understand this. The activation is coming. The directive is signed. The world will not wait for you to be comfortable." The meeting ended there. As he walked back through Helix 9's corridors, his wrist terminal vibrated with new system messages. Full-scale activation sequence, scheduled. Control mode. Defense override, locked. Local abort authority, limited. The walls felt closer than they had the day he first came down to the complex. The hum of the system sounded less like support and more like a countdown. In his office, he pulled up the gate architecture again. The routes for power, the lattice, the defense pathway, the decision tree narrowed in front of him. Option 1 sat there, stark and heavy. Engineer a physical failure. Sabotage the hardware. Throw the array into a safe but violent shutdown before the override could complete. That would mean explosions, decompression, people injured or killed inside HELIX-9. A local disaster to avoid a planetary one. Option 2 was harder to define. Let the gate open. But seize the channel in another way. Use the fracture not as a power line, but as a conduit for something else, data. A different kind of signal. A move the other layer had not managed. Or had never tried. He thought of Daniel's 20 seconds of voice cutting across from the ruined slope. Of the simulation's cold maps. Of the technician on the catwalk reaching toward a light that was not meant for him. 11 days, he said quietly. Enough time to choose which price he was willing to pay. The last day began with a siren that did not sound like an alarm. It was softer, lower, a rising tone that threaded through Helix 9's corridors like a reminder. Screens all over the complex echoed the same message in calm text. TGA full-scale activation. T-4 hours 0 minutes and 0 seconds. Control mode. Defense override. Local abort authority, limited. In the control room, the lights were brighter than usual. Additional consoles had been rolled in and tapped into the main bus. Officers in dark uniforms stood beside engineers in pale worksuits. Their presence a physical expression of the defense override pathway Jonas had warned about. Aaron stood at his station, hands resting on the edge of the console. Mara stood to his right. Kira to his left. Tomas had been relegated to a backup terminal. His access curtailed after the hidden lattice modifications had been discovered. He was still there, though. Eyes on the data streams. Director Holt occupied the raised platform at the back again, flanked this time by a liaison from Strategic Oversight Command. Jonas stood near the door, helmet tucked under one arm. Final systems check, Aaron said. Field coils charged to initial baseline. Mara reported. Thermal loads within expected range. External grid demand? He asked. Kira answered. Every region that can connect is waiting. She said, if this works, they'll feel the relief within minutes. And if it doesn't, Tomas murmured, they'll feel something else. Aaron did not respond. He opened a private overlay on his main display. Behind the official control interface, a thin set of graphs represented his own modifications. The hidden layer inside the lattice that would choke efficiency as the gate approached the region the Council wanted to exploit. Beyond that, deeper, lay another set of changes. The ones he had written after meeting with Holt. They were dormant, tied to a condition the main system would recognize as a fault but the override pathway would treat as an opportunity. A one-time transformation. If the right combination of field intensity and temporal variance appeared, his code would reconfigure the gate's function. Instead of acting as a pump, it would become a focused transmitter. Not of sound, not of images, but of structured changes in the very pattern of the field, the only language the other layer could not ignore. He had packed that pattern with as much as the physics would bear. Compressed models of the collapse he had simulated. Parameters for safe operation. Warnings encoded as boundaries the other side could measure against. It was not a message in words. It was a map of how to step away from the edge. If they ever get a similar gate to this state, he had told Mara in a late-night session, the overlap will be enough for them to feel our push. You're assuming they haven't already fallen past that point, she had said. I'm assuming that any chance is better than none, he had replied. Now, the countdown ticked away the last minutes of that chance. Begin Phase 1, came the voice of the Society liaison from the back. HELIX-9. Acknowledge. Aaron's console lit with a request for confirmation. He swallowed once. HELIX-9 acknowledges, he said, spinning up the array. Deep below, the temporal gate array woke. The first surge of power ran through the coils like a heartbeat amplified to planetary scale. In the activation chamber, air shimmered around the lattice of metal and field projectors. The structure at the center glowed from no conventional source. Lines of artificial lightning crawled along its supports without burning them. In the control room, graphs rolled upward. Field strength, phase offset, containment margins. The adjustments he and Mara had made to the lattice responded as designed. Damping spikes, keeping the initial expansion smooth. We're tracking the predicted curve, Mara said. On the override console, separate numbers began to rise, values pulled from shadow parameters the defense pathway controlled. A thin line on Aaron's screen indicated the level the Society had chosen as their true target. Well above the nominal threshold the scientific documentation recommended. We hold at Band 3 for 10 minutes, the Society liaison said, then proceed to 4 and 5. Confirm. Aaron eyed the lattice overlay. Band 3 was already flirting with the region his models had highlighted as the beginning of true coupling with the other layer. We have never sustained at that intensity for that long, he said. That is why this is a test, Holt said. Her voice was steady, but there was tension around her mouth. We are not here to play with shadows. We need to know what the machine can do. The SOC liaison's gaze was colder. Proceed, he said. Aaron gave the command. The gate swelled. Helix 9 trembled as the fields fought the rock and steel that held them. The vibration translated into a low, almost inaudible hum that seemed to pass through bone rather than air. On the chamber monitor, the space around the array thickened, as if the air had acquired weight. Temporal variance index rising, Kira said, still within controllable range, but climbing faster than in previous runs. That's the override pressing the frequency, Tomas muttered. Aaron watched the thin line that represented his hidden efficiency limiter. As the field intensity grew, the line bent, exerting its subtle drag. On the grid interface, the expected energy yield dipped slightly below projections. The SOC liaison noticed. Why are the returns lagging? He asked. Probably early stage losses in the channel, Aaron said. "We're moving in regimes we have not fully mapped. We need to hold steady to let the lattice adapt." It was close enough to the truth to pass. The liaison nodded, eyes narrowed at the screen. "Maintain," he said. The minutes stretched. Outside HELIX-9. The world responded. Regional controllers reported a drop in strain as the gate's contribution began to supplement failing grids. Hospital wings brightened. Factories spun up lines that had sat idle through rotating outages. For a moment, the slow failing of the world paused. In the control room, the price of that pause was written in numbers. Variance index approaching the band we flagged in the simulations. Mara said quietly. "We're seeing early signatures of cross-coupling in the upper field layers." Aaron saw them too. The same knot-like fluctuations they had modeled. Now not as theoretical artifacts but as live disturbances in the fabric around the gate. "Defense channel is increasing drive," Kira said. "They're pushing toward their target band whether we like it or not." The warning indicators on his private overlay shifted from yellow to orange. Somewhere below, the air around the array took on a faint, icy brightness. Tiny motes of dust hovered instead of falling, caught in currents that did not exist in normal air. Aaron's terminal chimed with a condition he had defined himself. Field intensity. Critical band approaching. Temporal variance. Match with Echo 20 signature 0.89. The overlap was nearly perfect. The gate was touching the same catastrophic configuration that had birthed the Echo. His one chance was arriving. He did not move his hands immediately. For a few seconds, he watched the numbers climb, listened to the low murmur of the control room, the muted conversations between Holt and the society liaison. He thought of Daniel in the earlier layer, older than his own son had ever become, standing perhaps in a facility not unlike HELIX-9, speaking into a microphone as the world around him frayed. "You have to stop," the boy had said in those 20 seconds. Over the hiss of a dying sky. "You have to stop before." The rest had been lost in noise. Now, Aaron stood at the other side of that conversation. He could, in theory, try to use the growing overlap to do something more dramatic. Wrench information out of the other world. Pull matter across. Attempt some impossible exchange. The math did not prohibit it completely. It only made such attempts vanishingly unlikely to succeed without catastrophic side effects. He thought of all the stories he had read as a younger man, of parents who bent time backward to undo a loss. None of them had been written by people who understood what time really was. He breathed out. "I'm going to do it," he said quietly. Mara's hands tightened on the edge of her console. "Once you flip that switch," she said, "there is no going back. HELIX-9 won't survive." "It was never going to," he said, "not if they get what they want from it." She hesitated, then nodded once. "Then make it count," she said. He opened the buried control he had hidden inside the calibration routines, a command no one else in the room knew existed. The interface responded with a simple query. "Reconfigure channel function, confirm?" Warning. Irreversible under current conditions. His finger hovered for a moment. "I'm sorry," he thought, without knowing exactly who the thought was for. Daniel. The people on the surface who would see their brief respite fade. The version of himself in the other layer who had screamed into a broken microphone. He confirmed. The gate change. From the outside, the shift was subtle. There was no explosion, no visible lurch. Inside the field equations, the transformation was absolute. The lattice reoriented its purpose. Instead of smoothing the flow of energy into Helix 9's feeds, it began shaping that flow into a finely tuned pattern. The boundary between the layers, already thinned by the override's aggression, became a membrane designed not to siphon but to transmit. Aaron's private display filled with a cascading set of status lines. Encode pattern. Loaded. Echo 20 correlation channel. Locked. Information density. Maximum tolerable. On the main grid interface, the energy yield began to plummet. "Output is dropping," Kira said, alarmed. "We're falling well below the expected curve." The SOC liaison stepped forward. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Nothing intentional on our end," Aaron said, not taking his eyes off the data. The system may have hit a structural limit we did not see in the models. If we keep driving, we may. His words were drowned out by a new sound. It was not a siren or a mechanical noise. It was the bass rumble of the complex responding to forces it had not been built to handle. The floor vibrated under his feet. A railing somewhere down the corridor rattled against its mounts. Field harmonics are spiking, Tomas called from his station. We're seeing mode couplings that don't belong in a power transfer channel. Because it isn't a power transfer channel anymore, Aaron thought. The gate's inner structure flickered on the chamber monitor. For an instant, the cores looked transparent. Beyond them, a sky of twisted light appeared, the same arcs he had seen in the glitch before. But sharper now, more insistent. The overlay from the other layer was not a passive reflection anymore. It was a partner in a brief, brutal handshake. He watched as the encoded pattern he had prepared began to flow across that handshake. There was no visual for it, only numbers. Changes in phase and amplitude mapped onto the shared space between layers. A series of controlled distortions that would, in their receiving world, appear as strange but undeniable behavior in the gate's environment. Any physicist on that side with access to the data would be able to reconstruct the intent. He had included their own future in that intent. The simulations, the metrics, the thresholds beyond which the gate's continued operation would turn it from salvation into poison. Worst of all, the timeline of how long that death would take if left unchecked. The 20-second window defined by his son's voice became the anchor. The rest of the pattern wrapped around it like a shell, preserving its shape while adding new layers. Variance index is off the charts, Mara said. If this continues, the chamber walls won't hold. We knew they wouldn't, he said. On the upper platform, Holt gripped the rail. What are you doing to my machine? She shouted. Giving it a different job, he said. Her eyes widened as she realized what that meant. You're throwing away the only chance this world has to. No, he said, I'm throwing away the chance to make the same mistake twice. The SOC liaison lunged for the override console. Cut his access, he barked. Recenter control on the defense core. Force the channel back into standard. His voice cut off as the lights flickered. Helix 9's power systems, already strained by the gate's demands, stumbled under the reconfiguration. For a moment, the entire complex existed in a kind of half-light, all shadows and ghostly edges. On the chamber monitor, the array blazed. Aaron heard the sound of something deep below tearing. A crack, not in stone, but in the structures that kept the gate's fields from eating into the surrounding rock. Emergency safeties that had never been meant to handle this configuration tripped, trying and failing to redirect the load. The encoded pattern rushed toward completion. A timer he had not realized he was watching tick down the last seconds of the overlap. 8. 7. 6. The room around him seemed to narrow. The voices of the others became distant, muffled by the roar of the gate. His entire world collapsed into the numbers on his screen and the memory of a boy's voice calling through static. We thought we could control it. He had never heard the end of that sentence. He did not need to. 5. 4. 3. A warning flashed across his display. Structural integrity, activation chamber, compromised. Evacuation recommended. Get them out, he said to no one in particular. Mara understood. She turned to the room. Everyone who isn't on primary containment. Move, she shouted. Emergency routes only. Go. People ran. Kira hesitated, eyes on him. Go, he said. Find your kids when this is over. She nodded once and followed the others. The SOC liaison shouted about treason. Jonas grabbed his arm and dragged him toward the exit. Argue later, Jonas said. Move now. 2. The gate's core brightened to a painful white on the monitor. The overlay from the other layer grew grainy, as if their shared space were starting to burn. 1. The pattern locked. For a fraction of a second, the connection between layers crystallized into something that felt almost solid. If reality had a sound when it accepted a message, it would have been the deep, empty silence that fell at that instant, as if every other noise had stepped aside. Then the chamber blew apart. Later, he would only remember fragments. The world shook. The control room's glass window into the activation chamber shattered inward, showering the consoles with glittering shards. A wall panel tore free and slammed into the floor near him. He fell, felt a sharp pain along his shoulder, and tasted metal in his mouth. Automatic systems sacrificed parts of Helix 9 to save the rest. Blast doors slammed down, cutting off the worst of the pressure wave. Foam flooded burning sections. Auxiliary fields flickered into existence around critical hardware, letting less vital structures collapse in their place. The gate's core, deprived of its carefully balanced containment, tore its own housing apart and then collapsed, its fields snapping shut like a fist. When the noise finally subsided, Aaron found himself lying on his back, staring up at a ceiling with new cracks in it. Dust drifted down in slow spirals. Somewhere distant, sirens wailed in earnest now. He tried to move and hissed as his ribs protested. Blood warmed the side of his face, trickling from a cut he could not feel yet. He pushed himself up, one hand on a console for support. Most of the control room was wrecked. Several of the auxiliary stations had been crushed. The main displays hung at odd angles. The chamber monitor showed only static. Mara stumbled into view, coughing, her hair powdered white with dust. "You alive?" she asked. "Apparently," he said. "Then you did it," she said. He looked at the dead screens. "I did something," he said. What that something had accomplished on the other side, he had no way of knowing. The investigation took months. Teams from the Global Energy Council and Strategic Oversight Command swarmed HELIX-9. They mapped every fracture, catalogued every melted piece of metal, reconstructed every log that had not been destroyed. Committees convened in distant cities to question survivors, assign blame, and draft narratives that would make sense to populations who had never heard the word variance. In the end, the official story was simple. A full-scale test of the temporal gate array had revealed catastrophic instability in the underlying architecture. Attempts to stabilize the system had been partially successful, preventing total destruction, but at the cost of irreparable damage to the core apparatus. Given the risk, the Council could not justify further operation. The project was suspended indefinitely. There were whispers, of course. Some called it a miracle that Helix 9 had not become a crater. Others muttered words like sabotage and treachery. Aaron's name appeared in footnotes and closed session transcripts, associated with phrases like unauthorized modification and unilateral action. He kept his own counsel. His clearance was revoked. His access to Helix 9 systems was terminated. He was offered a quiet exile in the form of an early retirement package. Framed as concern for his health after the traumatic event, he took it. The world did not end. The grid sagged again, beyond what the brief experiment had repaired. Rolling outages returned. Some regions adapted, others did not. New initiatives sprang up, massive efficiency drives, desperate pushes for incremental improvements. None promised miracles. But no one rebuilt the gate. The echo came back to him on a gray morning, long after the last investigator had filed the last report. He was in a small apartment near the coast now, far from HELIX-9. The air carried salt instead of dust. The hum in the walls came from ordinary transformers, not experimental machinery. He had a modest desk, a worn chair, and a single terminal with no special privileges. On its storage, in a folder with no label, lay a file he had copied before they cut him off from the deeper systems. Echo 20 Original Capture. He had listened to it so many times in the past that he could recite every hiss and crackle. He had stopped playing it after the full-scale activation, not because it hurt less, but because it meant something different now. Today, for reasons he could not explain even to himself, he opened it again. The waveform appeared, a short bar of sound, 20 seconds of another world dying. He pressed play. Static filled the small room. Then, underneath it, Daniel's voice emerged, older than his son had ever been in this layer, but still unmistakable. "You have to stop," the recording said. "You have to stop before the sky turns into." The interference chewed the word into fragments. He knew what came next. A gasp as the speaker inhaled through smoke. A short, half-formed sentence. A last burst of noise. Except this time, it did not end there. At 19 seconds, the pattern changed. The static shifted, thinned, as if a narrow signal were slicing through it from below. Daniel's voice dropped in volume, not because it had grown weaker, but because the channel itself had been altered. The final second stretched, not in actual time, but in the density of information it carried. He heard a breath, calmer than before. Then, very softly, a single word. Enough. The file ended. Aaron sat very still. It might have been an artifact, a defect in the way his terminal rendered the old data, a trick of expectation. There was no proof, nothing he could take to a committee and lay on a table as evidence that his last act in Helix 9 had done anything at all beyond wrecking a machine. But the presence of that extra word, in a space he knew had been empty before, was not something he could dismiss. He replayed it several times, isolating the final second. The shape of the waveform was different. The noise was different. The breath was different. All his training told him to distrust impressions, to demand hard measurements, repeatable tests, independent confirmation. Time did not offer those. What it offered, on the rare occasions when people tried to push against it, were brief, ambiguous traces. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Somewhere, in another layer of the universe, a version of his son had stood under a broken sky and sent a desperate warning. Now, perhaps, that same world had received something in return. A pattern in their own failing gate that did not match any of their equations. A hint that the future could bend in a direction they had not seen. Maybe they would ignore it. Maybe they would not. He would never know. What he did know was this: in his own lair, the machine that had tempted leaders to gamble with reality lay silent. The councils who had once talked about bold risk now spoke cautiously of boundaries. And the boy whose death had once been reduced to a regrettable line in an old message thread had, in some small, unrecorded way, changed the course of more than one world. Aaron opened his eyes. Outside the window, the morning remained gray. The sea rolled against the shore as it always had. The lights in the buildings across the street flickered once as the grid shifted, then steadied. He saved the file under a new name. 20_seconds, final. It was not evidence. It was not a weapon. It was simply a reminder. Time did not offer corrections for private grief, but it had given him one narrow chance to stop an error from echoing forever. He had taken it. For him, that was enough. In the end, the world did not change in a single dramatic instant. Lights still flickered. Oceans still rolled against tired shores. And most people would never know that 20 seconds of borrowed time had bent their future away from a quiet extinction. Somewhere, in a sealed archive and in the memory of one man sitting by the sea, the echo of a different sky was all that remained, a small, stubborn proof that sometimes the bravest choice is not to win, but to make sure no one else loses the way you did. If this story spoke to you, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who loves science fiction, and subscribe to the channel so more tales like this can find their way to you.